Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Samvad Talk series organized by IIIT Bangalore. Continuing on our current theme of technology for multiomics data analysis, today's Samvad Talk is titled Towards Machine Learning Assisted Precision Epigenomics and shall be delivered by Tanmay Narendra. Today's session will be chaired by Professor Jaya, who is currently working as an associate professor at IIIT Bangalore. So over to you, Professor Jaya.
Thank you, Amrita. It's my pleasure to introduce Tanmay. Tanmay was our IM Tech student from the very first batch. So it's very special to have Tanmay back on our campus, virtually, albeit, to give the Samvad talk. So Tanmay currently is a PhD candidate with Dr. Gabriel Schweikert at the University of Tübingen and the International Max Planck Research School for Intelligent Systems. She has graduated from here in 2017, so she belongs to the batch that joined in 2012. She worked at IBM Research India as a software engineer, and from what I know, she used to be part of the music club while she was at IIIT Bangalore, and she sings fabulously. Um, so in today's talk, she is going to talk a bit about her research. She's working on machine learning assisted techniques for precision epigenomics. So she's going to give an overview of several challenges and opportunities she has encountered while working on it. And this is a very important topic for us to get into given our interest in moving into multidisciplinary applications, even at IIIT Bangalore. So over to you, Tanmay, and welcome back again.
Thank you very much, Jaya ma'am. So I'll just get started. Um, Today's talk is mainly about what I put in the title, which is machine learning assisted precision genomics. And I'll be talking about a machine learning approach that we developed and some challenges and opportunities that I see going forward. And before I start, I just want to list all the people I worked with, because this was truly a collaborative effort. So I want to acknowledge Alex, Giovanni, Matteo, Bernhard Sholkov, and my supervisor, Gabriele. And the outline of the talk is as follows. First, I will give you a very quick overview of epigenetics, and I hope I can convince you why it is important to study it. And then I will introduce our machine learning model for imputation of epigenetic signals. And lastly, I'll talk about some specific challenges that we encountered while working with this kind of data, and some very basic steps that we can do to kind of mitigate them. So I'll just get started. If there are people in the audience who are like biologists or have a biology background, I guess the beginning part of the talk is very basic, but I thought I'll just put it in there just so that everyone is on the same page. So what is epigenetics? Genetics is the study of DNA, and epigenetics is involves the study of features that are on top of or in addition to the study of DNA. So what does that mean? If you consider a eukaryotic cell, so eukaryotic means that it has a nucleus. So this is the nucleus, and the nucleus contains chromatin, and the chromatin can either be loosely or tightly packed inside. And yes, so then the nucleus contains chromosomes, and these chromosomes have DNA that is packed inside of it, and the DNA itself is wound around these histone proteins, and each of these individual unit of a histone protein along with the DNA is called a nucleosome. And these histones have poly A tails that can be modified with the addition of methyl acetyl or other groups, and these are called post-translational modifications. And finally, some bases in the DNA can be chemically modified with the addition of methyl groups, and this is called DNA methylation. And all these different aspects of genetics that is on top that doesn't involve the DNA, that is what epigenetics is about. And why is epigenetics important? So epigenetic mechanisms control and regulate genes. So they are responsible for propagating cellular responses. They determine cell type and cell identity. So which means that every different cell has a different epigenetic profile. So for example, a heart cell would have different epigenetics compared to, say, a liver cell or compared to a brain cell. And the other thing about epigenetics that's maybe different from genetics is that it keeps changing at different time scales. For example, it changes at cell cycle scale, which is comparatively short, and it also changes through the development and aging of an organism. So, for example, the epigenetics of a child would be very different from somebody who's maybe 80 years old. So it also changes over time. So it should come as no surprise that they're involved in a lot of neurological, neurodegenerative diseases, and also responsible for developmental disorders and certain forms of cancer. And that's why they are so widely studied. And I hope I've also convinced you why this is an important subject to study. But in this particular talk, I will be focusing on a subset of epigenetic mechanisms called histone modifications. And like I said before, histones are proteins that are around which the DNA is wrapped around. So if you can see this ball-like structure is the histone, and it has the DNA that is wrapped around it. And this structure of the DNA and the histone is called a nucleosome, and this entire structure is called beads on a string because it kind of looks like a necklace. And like I said before, the tails of these histones can be chemically modified with the addition of methyl and acetyl groups. And coming to the challenge of profiling these histone modifications for, say, the human body. Why this is challenging is that, like I said before, it's cell type specific. So each cell has different histone modifications. Also, there are many different kinds of histone modifications, and it's expensive and time consuming to profile all of them. So just for an example, the cost of sequencing is going down, but it's still not as cheap as you want it to be. So it does take a lot of money and also time, and you need skill to profile all of these histone modifications. So for this particular talk, the focus is that can we use existing experimental data to impute the results of unperformed experiments. So the idea is that there's already a lot of experimental data available. Can we use that to kind of in silico, so use computational methods to predict what the signal would look like for experiments that are not done? And obviously the answer is yes, because if the answer was no, there would be no talk. And this is what I'll cover in the rest of the talk. Going forward, so I just also want to explain the data set that we kind of have. We use the data from the Roadmap Consortium. It's a very, very big, large-scale project, and this is openly available. It is a collaboration of multiple universities. So to explain the plot, so everything that is colored, so if a square is blue, orange, or green, it means that that experiment has been done and the data is publicly available. Everything that is in the gray region is it's not done. The experiment is not done. On the y-axis, we have different histone modifications. So the first one, I know the font is a bit small, but I had to compress it to fit it in the slide. Except the first one, the rest are all histone modifications. And on the x-axis, we have different cell types. So yeah, at the beginning, we have some stem cells, and then just goes on, and that's the explanation. The first track is DNA-seq. So it's a experimental procedure to measure accessibility of chromatin. So, but everything other than that are all histone modifications. Some more statistics about the data. So there are totally 1,014 signal tracks and 24 kinds of epigenetic assays and 127 cell types. And for our method, we used 706 as the training set, 102 for validation, and 203 for test. Now I'll explain a little bit about the model itself and what it does and how it works. We look at I hope it was clear. So the point is that we have all this data and we want to predict what's missing. That's the problem statement. We look at the imputation problem as a problem of combinatorial generalization. So basically, you have a set of combinations of cell types and assays, and we want to predict how it would look like for unobserved combinations of cell types and assays. And we solved this with a factorization approach. So in the first part is how previous methods solve it. So basically, you have a cell type embedding C and, given a cell type and an assay and a genomic position K, we want to predict the strength of the signal. So you have an embedding for the cell type, an embedding for the assay, and an embedding for the genomic positions. And you use some kind of parametric function to estimate the signal. However, in our approach, it's mostly similar, but with one difference. Instead of learning independent embeddings for each genomic location, we condition the cell and assay representation. So it's this one on the observed signal from all tracks. So what this means is that we don't need to learn a specific embedding for the genomic position. And as I'll show later, that actually saves us a lot of, decreases the memory footprint and also helps us train it faster. I hope this is clear. So maybe I can also explain it with the diagram. So the first part of it is the signal embedding. So where we use this, if YCK is a partially observed signal vector for all assays of a given cell type for the kth genomic bin. So going forward, maybe you'll notice me saying genomic bin because we don't predict for each single base or nucleotide. We bin the genome into 25 base pair bins because it reduces the amount of predictions we need to do, and it's also the standard practice used by previous approaches. And this is just this embedding is just basically a scaling factor that we do depending on how much data we have in other cells. And this cell type specific local signal vector is mapped to an embedding space here with a nonlinear function, and this function is shared by all cell types. So it's just a fully connected layer with the ReLU activation. And then we also add this local cell type embedding that we learn. And this is learned for all cell types. So it's sorry, I said local, but it's global. Yes, now coming to the next bit, which is the self-attention block. This is similar to the self-attention used in other transformers, except it doesn't have a layer norm. And it uses these representations that are learned. And we use a four-headed self-attention block and to get these contextual cell embeddings. So we use it at a very high level. What it does is that it uses the data from other assays to condition the representation that we have learned for this particular assay cell type combination. And that is what we call the contextualized cell embedding. And the last step is that you basically the same thing is also repeated for assays. So assay is the measurement of the histone modification. And basically you take these two contextualized embeddings and pass it to a fully connected block, a multi-layer perceptron, and then that is the prediction. And this is trained normally with backpropagation. Just as a comparison sake, so this is the previous state of the art predicted and avocado, and they have parameters in the order of billions, but because and each of these models learns a separate representation for each genomic bin. But with our method, since we use this contextualized cell type and assay embedding, we can greatly reduce the number of parameters that we need. So going forward, I just want to show an explanation of how these predictions look like, because I think that will help understanding how the data looks. So this is an example of reconstruction. So this is cell type E25, and the histone modification is H3K9 acetylation. And on the x-axis, we have the genomic position. So we did all our evaluation on chromosome 21. And so basically what you're seeing on the x-axis is the base pair number. And on the y-axis is the arc signage of the negative log 10 of the p-value. So, and this is what the prediction is, what we're predicting. So let me just go over how this kind of data looks like. So usually histone modifications are measured with sequencing technology called ChIP-seq. And with ChIP-seq, how the way the signal is quantified is that you measure the enrichment of the treatment over control, and using MAX, which is the standard bioinformatics tool that is used, you measure the enrichment in this negative log 10 p-value, and that is what we predict as the genome-wide signal. And there's another terminology in ChIP-seq called peaks, and peaks are basically contiguous regions that are enriched. So I hope it's clear in the slide, but as you can see, so the blue one is what is in observation, and the brown one is what we predict. So this is the peak region for the prediction, and this is the peak region for the observation. And this is similarly, you can see how the performance looks like here. Why peaks are important is that for any downstream bioinformatics processing, people usually find regions that are enriched. And maybe I should also mention that the percentage of peaks compared to the background is always like maybe 5 to 10% of the genome. So it's a very highly imbalanced kind of prediction problem, because most of the time it's noise, and then in some regions you would have peaks like this. Okay, I will move on to some of the metrics for the evaluation. From previous methods, we similar to previous methods, we compute means MSE of the global signal and genome-wide correlation, Pearson correlation, and we also compute additional metrics like mean squared error in the foreground and foreground correlation, and background mean squared error, background correlation. And if we consider the peak region as 1 and the background as 0, then you can treat it as a classification problem. So we can have different classification metrics like F1, MCC, and precision and recall. So I think, as you can see, blue color is our model, and it does well on mostly all metrics. There are which is the green one, especially in recall, seems to do better, and maybe even AUPRC. But I have to mention that Chrome Impute is a regression-based technique, and it does leave one out cross-validation. So it uses more data than what we do. So we are at a disadvantage while comparing to Chrome Impute. So going forward, so maybe I also just want to give an idea of how noisy these signals are. So one of the main things when we were working on this model is the predictions should be able to predict differences between tissues, because that is really important. If you just predict the same thing for all tissues, it's not very useful. So if you look at this particular histone modification, H3K9 monoacetylation, and this is a non-specific peak. So each of these signals have, when the experiment is done, it's done with multiple replicates. So you don't do the experiment just once, you do it multiple times. And in the pre-processing step, they're kind of aggregated together to create an average kind of track. But if you even look at the replicates, it's very noisy. And but this is a non-specific peak, and it's kind of expected that we do well on prediction of this. So you can see the imputed signal is in the it's the dashed lines. Then and now looking at tissue specific peaks, we also do reasonably well. These are the replicas for two different cell types, E25 and E52. And you can see the imputations, how they are, they're cell type specific. To assess how well they capture this cell type specific difference, we also did a complete bioinformatic analysis from the predictions to see if it's similar. The main goal of this analysis is to see if the imputations can identify differential peaks. And the reason why we do this is differential peak calling is a very important step in the bioinformatic analysis of ChIP-seq. And so this is one of the results from a standard bioinformatics tool called DiffBind. And it's basically showing you so the color of the square indicates the correlation, and on the X and Y axis is just the different replicas. So S stands for simulated and M stand for measured. So for E25, we simulated 4 replicas similar to the measurement. And for E52, we simulated 3 replicas similar to the measurement. If anyone is interested, E25 is an adipose mesenchymal stem cell, and E52 is a muscle satellite cultured cell. So they are quite different. And the good thing is, from the analysis, is that we can see that they cluster separately. So from the dendrogram, you can see that it's 2 different clusters. Sorry, it's the next. Yes. And we also see that they captured similar block structure in the signal. And we also did this Venn diagram to see how many differentially enriched peaks are common between measurement and imputation. And I think from my estimate, it's around 2/3 of peaks that we do predict as enriched between measured and imputation. So the thing is, while we do have these individual replicas in the data, the input, that the training data that we use is still an average. So in a sense, we don't really have we just have the mean of the distribution. We don't have the average. of the distribution, and we're just comparing. This is the true data, and we're just comparing the predictions, which don't really have the variation as an input to the measured data. And coming to the last bit, I also want to talk about how we were able to use this eDice for personalized enrichment. So, like I said before, epigenetic mechanisms are related to human disease, especially with chromatin state and gene expression, because they regulate that a lot. And understanding personalized epigenetic signatures can help with predictions for risk stratification, drug resistance, or development of new therapies. So we were able to use pre-trained eDice and fine-tune it for different individuals. So there are two male people and two female people, and we were able to fine-tune the model to make predictions for this. And this is using the NTEX data, which has 29 tissue assay combinations that are available for 4 different individuals. I just want to highlight one of the results that I thought was very cool. So this is one specific peak, which is, so blue is for observed and red is for what our imputation is. And this is a individual specific peak. So you can see that only two tracks have this peak and the other two don't. So we are able to predict differences in among individuals, and which is what we wanted to do. So I thought that was really nice. Okay, so I will change tracks a little bit and talk a little bit about the p-value enrichment signal that we actually predict, because while we were working on this project, we kind of encountered these extreme cases of p-values, and we were curious to see why this actually happens, and we dug a little deeper. And I just also want to share those results a little bit. So like I said before, the prediction is a minus log 10 p-value. And with eDice, we use an arc-signage transform as a pre-processing step, because some of the p-values are extremely high. Some of the minus 10 log 10 p-values are extremely high. So it's difficult to predict those. So we use an arc-signage to kind of smooth out the extremes. But we wanted to dig a little deeper why this extreme p-value even happens. And the basic assumption with p-values is that for the null hypothesis, the p-value should follow a uniform distribution. However, when we computed permutation nulls of the measure of the data that we have, basically what that means is that you kind of combine the measurements from both treatment and control, and you randomly shuffle it to create a pseudo treatment and a pseudo control, and you do the same peak calling steps, and then you check the p-value distribution. This is a permutation null, and theoretically it should be a uniform distribution, but as you can see from the plots, it's really not. And maybe I should also point out that this is in log scale on the y-axis, so it's really highly skewed for certain values. And there's another confounding factor for p-values, which is the effects of accessibility. So when this ChIP-seq experiment is done, regions of the genome that are easily accessible, which is euchromatin, which is lightly packed, they're easier to sequence compared to heterochromatin, which is very tightly packed. So which basically means that for euchromatin, you get a very high enrichment, whereas for heterochromatin, you don't. And what this means is that histone modifications that are associated with open regions, you always predict higher confidence. But for histone modifications associated with extremely tightly packed regions, which are associated with gene repression, where the gene is not expressed, then the signal is not at a very high confidence level. So this is an additional confounding factor with the p-values. Um, and there's another confounding factor of coverage. So like I said, for these experiments, um, there are usually two kinds of measurements that are done. One is the treatment, and on the x-axis is the control. So the color coding is based on the minus log 10 p-value. So as you can see, the most highest values happen where the coverage at the control is very small, which is very close to 0 or 1. And this is an extreme case with E58, that it has extremely high p-values, and they all happen at regions where the control coverage is very small. So this is just another confounding factor, that if so coverage basically means that when you do short read sequencing, how many reads cover that region of the genome. So in what this means is that you have some reads in the treatment, but you have nothing in the control. So you're basically comparing something to nothing, and maybe that's not a correct comparison. And that's why you're getting these very extremely high p-values. So yeah, that is one of the recommendations that we have, is that to do control sequencing of the control track at a deeper depth, so that we can get a better coverage of the genome for these kind of tracks. The thing is, people usually, as an experimentalist, we are only interested in the treatment, and typically you wouldn't want to spend too much money on the control. But looking at the data, it does look like sequencing the control is very important, because otherwise you would just have you would have artifacts in your signal that you get later, and because you don't have enough coverage, you don't have enough depth to cover the entire genome. Um, so the thing is, it's of course, one approach is to develop lots of new tools for peak calling, but this is a very established kind of pipeline, and it's hard to we didn't want to do that. So one very simple way is to compute the permutation null and quantile normalize this to the uniform distribution, and use the same transformation on the observed signal. So in that way, there is some kind of normalization. However, this approach is still a little bit flawed, because as you can see, the permutation signal, it goes up to 10 to the power minus 32. But the raw signal it goes very, very small, and you cannot do you cannot do quantile normalization for any values that are smaller than this. So it is a bit of a issue. I actually expected a lot of questions during the talk, so I intentionally left out a lot of things. So I've actually done quite early on time. So to summarize, I presented EDICE, a machine learning model for imputation, and I discussed some challenges of using p-values as a measurement of enrichment. If you are interested to read more, we do have a lot more metrics and graphs and pictures about the results. This is the name of the preprint. It should be coming, it will be on bioRxiv in the next few days, by the end of the week. So that is it. And these are the references. The first one is for the Roadmap Consortium. The second one is for NTEX, which is the personalized epigenome. And the last one is for MAX, which is the tool that is used for peak calling. So thank you very much. And I hope there are questions, because that's why I intentionally made the presentation quite short.
Right. Thank you, Tanmay. Yeah, we have a lot of questions for you. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful talk. So so you did talk about that experiment with 4 people, right? Yeah. So I'll leave the floor open for other questions as well. So while I think I can see Chandrasekhar has unmuted himself. Chandrasekhar, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. So thank you, Tanmay. I think congratulations on transforming yourself from an IT person to a bioscientist, and I think that was very nicely presented. So obviously, I don't know enough about the subject to be able to ask specific questions on the work that you did. But I was just curious about the kind of computational demands that these kind of experiments take. Especially how did you manage, and so what kind of computational resources, because that is something that even as an institution we also debating whether we should keep going for larger and larger computational facilities, or and we also come to know that there are a lot of on-demand computational labs that are available online and stuff like that. So I'm just curious about your experimental setup purely from an IT perspective.
So this is the roadmap data set, and it's actually it's very big. It's publicly available, but um, so these are average. So these are average tracks, but you also have individual replicas for each of these experiments. So the scale of data is extremely big. So I'm talking about like each of these tracks would be, say, more than 100 to 200 MB. So, and like if you were to download the individual, so this is after processing, but if you want the raw data itself, I would say it's at least 2-3 GB for each single track. So it was a bit of a struggle for us to, we don't have enough space to download everything. So that's why our entire evaluation is just done on the smallest chromosome, that is chromosome 21.
Mhm.
And yes, it has a lot of computational demand, I would say.
I can
And
imagine.
the data sizes are very big. Even not just from a like an IT perspective, that it's you need a lot of infrastructure to store it, but also from a machine learning point of view, the data is high dimensional. And like I said, right, like you have, I don't know, in billions of genomic positions and only three paradigm of thinking.
This is
So
fat data, right?
yeah.
This is what you call fat data, right? You have large N and small p or something like that, or vice versa. I don't know which one you call it. Yeah, small N and large p, right? That's what.
Yes, exactly. It's extremely high dimensional. And for us, the storage was definitely an issue. We had to download one by one, like trim all the rest of the genome and then save it and delete the rest. That's one of the tactics that we used.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So, following up on Chandrasekhar's question, right? So, you use most of the tools that are already available, right? I mean, not all of these are built from scratch. So, all of these tools should also be running on the cloud facilities and all of that, right? Or do you have to run them locally on your servers and machines? Or
No, I don't run anything on my machine because I don't have the space. Usually, how it, as far as I know, so the way it works is that the wet lab biologist will do an experiment and send it to a sequencing facility, and the sequencing facility uploads the data to the cloud, and you can download it. But the sequencing company also has some in-house tools that you can do some very basic kind of analysis. But as far as I know, the rest of it, a bioinformatician would do the individual steps. And I'm not, I think there are tools on the cloud. I'm not aware of it because I work with the data that comes after the bioinformatician has looked at it. But a lot of the infrastructure is actually in R, which is not what I'm not actually not so good at R because I use Python a lot, but most of the bioinformatics ecosystem is built in R.
Yeah.
So
Most of the packages are available in ours.
yes, yes. There's really like, there's no question of using Python for any of this analysis. You have to use R.
Right, right. Yeah. So going back to your samples, I was trying to see. So when you talked about those four different samples, two male and two female subjects and all of that. So what kind of cells were you studying? Like, could you give some more ideas on like, I mean, like if it was say, what kind of diseases and which
Okay.
type of cells did you study on so that we kind of connect the dots, right? So,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sorry. That I think the challenge for me has also been that there's a lot of jargon in biology, and I really tried not to bring that here, but I think I've somehow managed to make some things confusing. Um, so these are not individuals with any disease, because it's a large scale mapping project. They take healthy individuals just to know what is the baseline, to give an idea of the cells. So there are a few steps that I missed. So the thing is, it's not like there is no universal definition of exactly what is a tissue, because like at what granularity do you want to separate the cells, right? So we had to do some kind of manual mapping of these cell types to what we have in the roadmap consortium. And I cannot tell you on the top of my mind, but just to give an idea of the cells, there are a few embryonic stem cells. So these are what is here. And you have different tissues. So skin cells, heart cells, liver cells. Um, um, there's different kinds of cells from the brain. Actually, I can also post the metadata sheet is publicly available. So if anybody wants to look at it, I can share it. Yeah, and then maybe you can get a complete idea of all the different cell types. And there's lots, right? This, so this, I just saw this is fetal kidney. So it goes from different stages of development, from developing tissues to adult tissues, and also cell lines and cultures to combined tissues. So for example, the embryonic cells, they would be cell lines. So they've been cultivated to be completely pure. So they would be only one kind of cell. But if you would take, say, a fetal lung, it's a mixture of different kinds of cells. So it's really and also the other confounding thing is that they're not from the same age group, sex, ethnicity. So it's really a huge average of different things.
Yeah.
So usually, how do you? So you have these computational methods that you develop. So how do you go about validating your results? Do you do it purely from literature, or do you just compare what the other similar tools, like state-of-the-art tools, give you? Because it's going to be very hard for you to figure out specifics, right? When it comes to cell name types, I believe you would be using the standard names and all of that, right? They probably have some standards that they follow to name each cell type and all of that, right?
Yes, there are standards, but it's I don't think it's completely set in stone. Yes, I think the question is very valid. That validation is very important. So that's why I don't know if you noticed in the talk, the actual bit about the model is very short, but we had to do almost months, almost a year of evaluation just to see if what the model predicts is actually useful and correct. And because I think that if you want to make a claim in this, you have to be very sure that it really works. So that's why we also followed these like fed the predictions through the standard bioinformatics pipelines, just to see if they actually predict and do what they're supposed to do. I can also mention that so in these metrics, right, all the previous state of the art, they do genome wide mean squared error and genome wide correlation, or genome wide uh, precision and recall. And we actually introduced these other metrics of separating foreground and background, and evaluating only on the peak regions and not on peak regions. Because we, as like for a bioinformatician, you don't really care about the background, you're only interested in those enrichments. And like the most of the previous art, state of the art, they don't talk about this. So validation, sometimes in computational methods, it's possible to, if you're if it's a feasible experiment to do, then you can, if you can convince biologists to do the experiment, you can do experimental validation, but this takes a lot of time and effort. And but even for our we didn't predict any of the gray areas, we are always predicting something that's already existing, so that we can quantitatively evaluate.
Exactly. Yeah. And once you're confident, you can probably, move into the uncharted territory. Maybe I don't know. Again, in biology, you would still need validation, and that comes from the experiments. So Srinath has raised his hand first, so I'll ask him to ask a question.
Yeah,
And then,
hi, Tanmay. Thanks for an interesting talk. So yeah, I mean, even like Professor RC was saying, I could not get the biology part of it, and I'm not really, um, into this. So my question is kind of pretty general in that sense. That's why. So I'm wondering. So basically, what you're trying to do is to impute some values, unknown values in this genomic data set, right? And what is the biological significance of this, especially when you're using machine learning? In that sense, there's no explainable model for these values behind. You know that you're there is some explainability, but you can't actually see the explainability, right? And so what is the biological significance of these imputations? What kind of challenges would that solve, and how reliable would those downstream results be, from this imputation? That's the first one. And my second question is a little bit even more generic. Just trying to understand, your motivation in taking up such a problem, right? I mean, what in the larger scheme of kind of things that are available, even in say bioinformatics, if you want to say, why particularly the imputation problem in epigenetics? What's the motivation?
Okay. Yes, very good questions, I think. So, one, the question about reliability, that's, I don't know if it was clear, but that's why we do a lot of evaluation to see if the imputations can be actually used for downstream tasks, and if we can, if any of this is actually useful. So um, uh, so this part, this analysis that we did, which we checked whether we can identify differences between tissues, and that if we can capture sort of the similar block structure between tissues in measurement and imputations, is this we followed a very standard bioinformatics pipeline to do differential peak enrichment, just to see that if these imputations are actually useful. And also, like I said, these specific metrics that we identified, which we evaluated on a specific for these peak regions, only because we know that for a bioinformatician or somebody who might use these imputations for downstream tasks, it's important for them. The question of explainability, I'm not sure if it's very relevant for this task, because as far as I can see, my very extremely personal opinion is that I don't think it's ready to be used as a replacement for any experiment. I think, for example, imputations could be used if, for in some case, if you want to quickly see if the feasibility of some experimental protocol and you just want some toy data to play with. I don't think it's reached a stage where it can, like, instead of doing an experiment, we can completely use a machine learning model. Because I think, like, maybe to be very honest, you can see this, right? There's a lot of biological variation which we cannot, like, the model is not set up to capture it in a very, like, you can see it almost very clearly. So in this particular example, this is E25. So these two are actually samples from the same person. So it's the same donor, and these two are different. So there's some kind of, this is a technical variation, and this is biological variation. And we don't really capture all that because we only model average. We don't model the standard deviation or the variation. So I don't think it's reached a stage where we can completely use it as a replacement for anything. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I hope, like, with new methods, we can improve it further. And coming to the motivation, I think the reason is why people would do this is that at least there is some alternative, because usually, like, the previous state of the art, right? I don't know. There's one called Avocado, and you can download the imputations from the roadmap website, and it's just to maybe use it as a proof of concept or to see feasibility, because right now there's no other alternative except to do the experiment, and these experiments are expensive. So I would say, like, it's upwards of 1 lakh to do one assay. So if you have cell type and histone modification combination, it would, I would say, 1 lakh rupees. So it's super expensive, and this is sort of like a cheaper alternative. If somebody has already done the experiment, you can at least have an idea of what the data might look like.
Okay. Thanks.
So yeah, I guess in most of these, you can't really predict actual values, right? You will only predict distributions and all of, because there's no real norm, or there's no standard for a variations, right? I mean, I think here also you're predicting only the differential enrichment, right? And that also only the distribution. It's not the actual values as such, right?
No, in differential enrichment, we check for those genomic regions that are significantly enriched. So you do need inter sample variation in the group to check, because you want to correct for the technical noise and then check for differential enrichment. So no, I don't think we're predicting values. But the thing about biology is that, like, I mean, at a very high level, right, everybody's heart functions the same mostly, like, given a few caveats here and there. So there is some kind of underlying rule, but there is also variation between individuals. So the hope is to, like, one of the things we write in the paper is that maybe we should move towards modeling even variation, because it's, at least it's a very important part of the biology, and just using averages.
Yeah, there was this lot of body of work, not in the biology domain, but management and pedagogy and so on. You know, I keep talking about this guy called Todd Rose in Harvard. He runs a lab called the Individualization Lab. So basically what he says is, as long as you're looking at one dimension, right? For example, say heart rate or something like that, blood pressure and so on. You can take averages, and averages can, can kind of mean something. But the moment you have many dimensions, averages don't mean anything. Because each individual is so different in when you are taking all the dimensions, then the average literally represents no one in that thing. So that might be an interesting read to to augment this.
Yes, I'll take a look at it, sir.
Sure.
Raghavan, you can unmute and talk if you're.
Yeah.
To see you again, and nice to see the transformation from a computer scientist to a, I guess, mini or pseudo biologist. It was, yeah. I mean, I was quite impressed with the comfort with which you were throwing all the bio jargon around in your talk. Okay, my question was basically on the same lines as Srinath. I was wondering what sort of explainability questions come up here, because I'm sure. I mean, I was quite surprised when you said explainability is not terribly relevant here. Can you tell me why? I mean, I thought it is very relevant. I mean, how would you, if you're making an imputation, you at the end of the day, you have to go back to a biologist and say, look, this is, I mean, you need to provide evidence in some form for the imputation that you're making. And that evidence is precisely the explanation that we're talking about, right? So explainability, I think, would be important. I mean, in some sense, I mean, it may not necessarily be a hard causal explanation, but there has to be explainability in some form or the other.
Yes, I think maybe I didn't say it properly. So this is, I mean, in biology, this is not like, these imputations are not, I mean, I don't see them being used in a very critical kind of setting. So like they will not make or break the use case, I feel. That's why I said explanations are not important. So I think I should have maybe included more plots from the, I think there's a difference between trying to explain how the model works and then trying to explain whether the predictions agree with what is already known in a biological setting. So I think to convince a biologist, more than like, there's a lot of gap. This is again my own personal feeling that if you try to say like, I don't know, if you use Lime or something to show that like this is the linear model and this is the decision boundary, it doesn't make that much sense to a biologist. But if you can show them with like plots like this, that you can identify tissue specific peaks, or if you can say that using a tool that they are familiar with, like with diffbind, you can identify differential peaks. I find that is for them more convincing than explaining the model, the computational model itself. But to be honest, we did try, because we use an attention-based model, right? We did try to do this kind of analysis with the attention heads to see if they do learn something useful. And we actually have included it in the supplementary material. The thing is, yes, they do learn something useful. For example, regions which are in open chrome. So I don't want to again throw jargon. So basically it does work. So promoter regions have the profile that we want to look for, and they are all correlated in these attention visualizations. But the thing with deep learning, like with this specific model, the explainability is that it's we don't have guarantees whether you'll get the same kind of explanation once you retrain the model, because the nature of the training is that it's very use SGD, right? So which we like, we don't know whether these explanations are the same or it can change. So for us, it was more convincing to do post prediction validation with the predictions that we got to see, like so if to see if these peaks are accurately predicted, or to do this kind of analysis between, if we can identify differences between tissues. because that made a lot more sense than trying to explain the model itself. Is that convincing?
No, I mean, it's not this or that, right? I mean,
yes, absolutely, yes.
So I mean, in spite of all your external validation, you will an explanation at the end of the day.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I can see that it's not easy. I mean, especially as the networks become complicated, it's very hard to generate explanations. But is there any work at all in that?
Yes, definitely. I think especially so we are predicting for healthy individuals, right? Like it's not related to any clinical outcome or related to any disease or in particular, but especially in models in biology where there is some kind of something related to clinical outcomes or involving drug usage or drug repurposing, then explanations become very important because like it becomes more critical, I feel. Okay. So there is a lot of work in trying to build interpretable deep learning models for this specific thing, or also trying to use interpretability and explainability approaches to explain and actually right now there's a lot of explosion of computational methods in single cell technology. So I just want to mention that all these measurements are done with bulk data, which means you have a petri dish and you put some cells and you do some stuff and you sequence it together. But now there is sequencing technology where you can identify from which cell the mRNA came from. Okay. So it has a lot more challenges compared to this kind of bulk, like you can see, like you can really measure the variation and not just averages on a cellular level. And I think there's a lot of work going on in explainability of that kind of data, because there's actually some lot of controversy and debate going around on what's the right pipeline or what's the right process to do to get real meaningful insight from that single cell especially.
Okay. So is your goal of your work, so building on the questions that Raghavan had asked, so is the goal to move on to looking at disease-specific kind of studies or clinical outcomes or drug repurposing from what you have right now? Or this is, so what would be the future of this kind of work that you're doing? What are your unanswered questions right now?
One of the things we definitely want to do going forward is modeling this variation, because we really see that it like as a bioinformatician, like they have spent a lot of years trying to convince biologists to do replicas, like don't do your experiment once but repeat it. And now it feels like they're somehow like combining and taking averages of all that work. So variation is very important, because with real biological data, you have technical noise, you have batch effects, you have sequencing noise. So modeling this variation is, I think, one of the steps that we want to go forward. And maybe like a shorter term goal is to definitely train this and release the predictions genome wide, because right now we only have chromosome 21. We do want to make the whole entire human, like predictions for the whole, all chromosomes.
Okay, then. Are there any other questions for Tanmay? So if there are no further questions, thank you so much, Tanmay, for coming in. And I also know, I mean, I guess I have to say on the record that you're also promoting a lot of work in for promoting gender and inclusivity in STEM studies and research and all of that, which is remarkable, and we are very proud to see you doing all of this in addition to handling your PhD commitments and all of that, right? So we're very thankful to you for being here, and continue doing that. Thank you so much, Tanmay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very nice to be here. I also like, maybe it's called a few of my friends, we started this, when I started my PhD, we started this organization called Women in STEM Research, just to more like a support peer network for women and gender minorities who are in STEM research. So yeah, it is nice to be appreciated for that. So thank you.
Wonderful.
Definitely, Tanmay. Yeah. So thank you all for attending the call so late as well. So, and thank you, Tanmay, once again. So see you all again. Bye.
Bye.